The sun beat down on a quiet suburban street as cars zipped past, each driver focused on their destination. A white SUV sat awkwardly on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking. Beside it, a middle-aged woman, immaculately dressed in a blazer and heels, stood with her arms crossed, glaring at the flat tire as if her sheer frustration might fix it. Her phone, gripped tightly in her manicured hand, occasionally buzzed with notifications, but she ignored them all, pacing back and forth. A black sedan pulled over a short distance behind her, and out stepped a tall, well-dressed man. His crisp shirt and polished shoes gave the impression of someone headed to a business meeting, but his demeanor was calm and approachable. He glanced at the stranded SUV, then at the woman, before calling out with a polite smile. "Ma'am, looks like you've got some trouble there. Do you need a hand?" The woman spun around, her sharp gaze locking onto him. Her lips pursed, and she took a moment before responding, her voice cold and clipped. "No, thank you. I've already called someone. You can be on your way." The man raised his eyebrows slightly but maintained his friendly tone. "I've got a jack and some tools in my trunk. It'll only take a few minutes to change that tire." She waved him off, her expression turning from irritated to dismissive. "I said no, thank you. I don't need help from." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she took in his appearance. "Someone like you. Just go." There was a pause, brief but heavy. The man's polite smile faltered, replaced by a neutral expression. He stood there for a moment, as if weighing his next words, then gave a small nod. "All right. If you're sure. Good luck." He turned and began walking back to his car, the tension in the air lingering like a storm cloud. The woman huffed and muttered under her breath, fiddling with her phone again. A moment later, she let out an exasperated groan, realizing that her roadside assistance app wasn't working. She glanced back toward the black sedan, where the man was now leaning against the hood, scrolling through his phone. She hesitated, her pride battling her growing frustration. "Of course, he'd just stand there and watch," she mumbled. Shaking her head, she decided to focus on her phone call instead. Minutes passed, and the heat grew unbearable. Sweat began to bead on her forehead, and she struggled to keep her composure. She tapped impatiently at her phone, still unable to get through to the help she was expecting. Finally, she threw up her hands in frustration and stomped back to her car, muttering about incompetent services and unreliable technology. Meanwhile, the man in the sedan hadn't left. He stayed parked, his attention seemingly elsewhere. A delivery van pulled up beside him, the driver hopping out with a package. "Hey, man! Good to see you," the driver called out cheerfully, handing the man the box. "Thanks, appreciate it," he replied, his voice carrying easily across the lot. The woman, now leaning against her car in a mix of irritation and exhaustion, couldn't help but notice the exchange. Her curiosity piqued as she observed how casually the two men spoke, the delivery driver even laughing at something the man said before driving off. Her phone finally rang, breaking her focus. She snatched it up and answered quickly. "Yes, I've been waiting for over an hour. When are you sending someone to fix my tire?" The voice on the other end was apologetic but firm. "Ma'am, we're experiencing delays due to high demand. It may take another hour before someone can reach you." She clenched her teeth, her voice rising. "An hour? Are you kidding me? I'm stuck here on the side of the road in this heat, and you're telling me I have to wait even longer?" The call ended with little resolution, leaving her seething. She glanced again toward the man by the sedan. He seemed entirely unbothered, sipping from a water bottle as he leaned casually against his car. Against her better judgment, she stormed over. "Excuse me," she barked, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The man looked up, his expression calm and almost amused. "Yes?" She hesitated, momentarily thrown off by his composed demeanor. "If you're so insistent on helping, fine. But let's get one thing straight, just fix the tire, and don't expect anything from me in return." His lips twitched into a faint smile, but he said nothing as he walked over to the SUV. He rolled up his sleeves and inspected the flat tire, then popped open his trunk to retrieve the tools. The woman hovered nearby, arms crossed, her expression a mixture of reluctance and indignation. As he worked, a few cars slowed down to look at the scene, but no one stopped. The man didn't seem to mind the attention, methodically replacing the flat tire with practiced ease. The woman, however, fidgeted uncomfortably, clearly bothered by the situation. "Are you almost done?" she asked impatiently. "Just about," he replied, tightening the last lug nut. He stood up, dusting off his hands, and glanced at her. "There you go. Good as new." She didn't thank him. Instead, she pulled out her wallet and thrust a bill toward him. "Here. For your trouble." He looked at the money, then at her, and shook his head. "I don't need that. Just happy to help." She frowned, clearly not used to being refused. "Take it." "I insist." "No, thank you," he said simply, turning back toward his car. Something about his calm refusal irritated her even more. She stuffed the bill back into her wallet, muttering something under her breath, then got into her SUV. As she started the engine, she noticed a sleek sports car pulling into the lot. The car's driver, a young man in a uniform, hopped out and approached the man by the sedan with a salute. "Sir, everything's ready at the dealership. Should I let them know you're on your way?" The woman froze, her hands still on the gearshift. She watched as the man nodded and exchanged a few words with the employee, who then handed him a set of keys. Curiosity turned to confusion, then to dawning realization. "Dealership?" she murmured, her eyes narrowing. The young man got back into the sports car and drove off, leaving the man from the sedan standing alone. He turned and caught her staring. For the first time, his polite smile carried a hint of amusement, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. "You're with a dealership?" she blurted, stepping out of her car. He shrugged casually. "Not just with it. I own it." Her jaw dropped. "You own a dealership?" "Yep." "That sports car you just saw?" "That's one of ours. Figured I'd check on things before heading to a meeting." He paused, letting the information sink in. "Funny how small the world is, isn't it?" Her face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and disbelief washing over her. The man didn't seem angry or smug, just amused by the turn of events. "Well," she stammered, searching for the right words. I didn't know." "I mean," he held up a hand, cutting her off gently. "It's fine. No harm done." But there was an undeniable shift in the air, a moment of uncomfortable silence that hung between them. She could feel her pride crumbling under the weight of her earlier behavior, but she didn't know how to salvage the situation. Before she could say anything else, the man gave her a nod, climbed into his sedan, and drove off. She stood there, watching his car disappear down the road, the realization of what had just happened settling heavily on her shoulders. For the first time that day, she was left with more than just a flat tire to fix. The woman stood frozen for a moment, still processing the interaction. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, but her mind replayed every detail of the last few minutes. She had dismissed him outright, assumed he was just some random passerby, and now she found out he owned a car dealership. A car dealership. And not just any dealership, judging by the way that employee had addressed him. Her chest tightened as she realized how dismissive, how outright rude she had been. As the SUV eased back onto the road, her thoughts raced. She didn't even know his name. Maybe that was for the best. He had seemed far too calm about the entire situation, almost like he expected her reaction. That realization only deepened her discomfort. Was she that predictable? Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the wheel, trying to shake off the embarrassment. But the incident lingered. The farther she drove, the more questions gnawed at her. Why hadn't he mentioned who he was? Why had he stopped to help her in the first place? People didn't just do things like that anymore, especially someone who clearly didn't need to. By the time she pulled into the driveway of her immaculate home, the day's events felt like a distant blur, yet the man's composed expression refused to leave her mind. She grabbed her purse and stepped inside, greeted by the sterile silence of her house. Everything was in its place, spotless and cold. Normally, that sense of control comforted her, but today, it only amplified the unease swirling inside her. She dropped her purse on the kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of iced tea, hoping to clear her head. But as she sat at the dining table, the silence became oppressive, her thoughts returning to the moment she first saw him. She remembered the way he had spoken to the delivery driver, the easy confidence in his voice. There had been no anger, no defensiveness, just calm. Her gaze drifted to the corner of the table, where a glossy catalog from a nearby car dealership lay unopened. She picked it up, thumbing through the pages absent-mindedly. Most of the cars were flashy, far more extravagant than anything she would ever consider buying. But her eyes caught on a familiar logo, one printed on the side of the employee's uniform who had addressed the man. Her heart skipped. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone and searched for the dealership's name. The first result was a sleek website, the kind that screamed luxury. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the link, before finally clicking it. The homepage loaded, displaying an elegant banner of cars parked under a sprawling glass showroom. Beneath it, a small About Us section caught her eye. She scrolled down, scanning the text until a photo stopped her cold. There he was, the man from the roadside, standing in front of the dealership. The caption confirmed it, owner and CEO. Her stomach dropped. His name was Christopher. According to the website, he had started the dealership almost a decade ago, building it from the ground up into one of the most successful in the region. The accompanying biography mentioned his extensive background in business and philanthropy, as well as a series of community outreach programs he had launched to support underprivileged neighborhoods. Her heart sank further with every line she read. He wasn't just successful, he was respected, admired even. And she had treated him like some unwelcome stranger. The iced tea sat untouched as she leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the weight of her assumptions. It wasn't just embarrassment, she felt it was shame. She had misjudged him based on nothing more than a passing glance, and now she couldn't stop wondering how different their interaction might have been if she just paused. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, relieved to see a text from her sister. It was a simple message, "How's your day?" For a moment, she considered typing a breezy reply, brushing off the day as uneventful. But something stopped her. Instead, her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed, "Do you ever feel like you misjudge people?" The reply came quickly, "What happened?" She hesitated, unsure how much to share. Finally, she typed, "Had car trouble. A guy stopped to help, and I wasn't very nice. Found out later he owns a dealership. Feel terrible." Her sister's response was blunt, "Sounds like you owe him an apology." Her chest tightened. Of course, an apology seemed like the obvious answer, but the idea of confronting him again filled her with dread. She didn't even know how to contact him, let alone what she would say. For the rest of the evening, she tried to push the thought aside. She busied herself with chores, scrolled mindlessly through her phone, and even turned on the TV to drown out her guilt. But nothing worked. His calm, unbothered expression kept flashing in her mind, along with the realization that she had been the only one creating conflict in their interaction. The next morning, she woke early, still restless. The idea of letting things go felt wrong, but she couldn't shake the fear of making things worse. After an hour of pacing her living room, she finally opened her laptop and returned to the dealership's website. The Contact Us page offered a customer service email, but she doubted that would reach him directly. Then she noticed a small event banner near the bottom of the page: Community Appreciation Day this Saturday. It was hosted at the dealership, with promises of food, music, and a showcase of their latest models. Her breath caught. It wasn't much, but it was a chance to see him again. She told herself it wasn't just about her guilt, it was about setting things right. If she didn't go, the regret would only fester. The days leading up to Saturday were filled with nervous anticipation. She rehearsed what she might say, trying to find the right words. She imagined his reaction, hoping he'd accept her apology but fearing he might brush her off. When Saturday finally arrived, she dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that struck a balance between casual and respectable. As she pulled into the dealership's parking lot, her heart raced. The lot was bustling with people, and colorful banners fluttered in the breeze. She hesitated before stepping out of her car, scanning the crowd for any sign of him. The dealership staff were friendly, directing visitors toward the main event area where tables of food and displays of cars were set up. Her eyes darted around, searching for the familiar figure. She spotted him near a group of guests, speaking animatedly as he gestured toward one of the showcase cars. He seemed completely at ease, his smile genuine as he interacted with everyone around him. Her nerves surged as she made her way closer, her hands trembling slightly. He caught sight of her before she reached him, his eyebrows raising in mild surprise. "Hello," he said, his tone polite but guarded. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Hi. I'm not sure if you remember me from the other day." His smile didn't waver. "Of course I remember. How's the car running?" Her face flushed. "It's fine. Thanks to you. That's actually why I'm here." She paused, struggling to find the words she'd practiced so many times. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how I acted. I was stressed, but that's no excuse. You didn't deserve that." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. Apology accepted. Relief washed over her, but his calm response left her feeling unsettled. She wanted to say more, to explain herself, but the words wouldn't come. "Thank you," she said quietly, stepping back as he turned his attention to another guest. As she walked away, the weight of her guilt began to lift, but a lingering question remained. Why had he stopped to help her in the first place? And why had he seemed so unfazed by her reaction? Something about him still felt like a mystery, one she couldn't quite solve. And as she left the dealership that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their story. The days after her visit to the dealership passed in a haze, but the encounter lingered in her mind. She had offered her apology, but something about Christopher's demeanor unsettled her. He had accepted her words with grace, yet there was no warmth behind them. It wasn't anger, it was something else, something that felt like quiet judgment. Her thoughts kept circling back to the moment she saw him surrounded by people, the way he commanded attention without demanding it. He was approachable, yet there was a distance about him that made her feel even smaller. It was as though he had seen straight through her, and no amount of words could undo the impression she had left. She tried to move on, burying herself in her routines. Yet every time she passed her car, the memory resurfaced. She thought about how easily he had stepped in to help, no hesitation or annoyance, despite how unkind she had been. That was what bothered her most, not his success, not his calm, but the quiet dignity in how he had handled the situation. One evening, scrolling idly through her phone, she came across an article about the dealership. It wasn't just a feature about cars but a piece highlighting their community outreach. Christopher's name was mentioned repeatedly, praise for his efforts to provide job training and scholarships in underserved areas. The article painted him as someone who cared deeply about making a difference. Her chest tightened as she read, the words confirming what she already suspected. He wasn't just some successful businessman. He was someone who genuinely used his position to lift others. She thought back to the moment he had stepped out of his car to help her, and the realization hit her like a wave. He hadn't stopped because he expected thanks or recognition. He had stopped because it was simply the right thing to do. The more she thought about it, the more unsettled she became. Why had she been so quick to judge him? She prided herself on being fair, but the truth was unavoidable. She had looked at him and made assumptions based on nothing but surface impressions. Her unease grew into a restlessness she couldn't shake. She had apologized, yes, but it didn't feel like enough. She needed to do something more, though she wasn't sure what. A week later, she found herself back at the dealership, her palms damp with nerves. It was a quiet weekday afternoon, and the showroom was less crowded. A receptionist greeted her with a polite smile, but she barely registered it as her eyes scanned the room. Christopher was standing near the back, talking with a group of employees. She hesitated, wondering if she was making a mistake. What could she possibly say to him now? But before she could change her mind, he glanced her way and spotted her. His expression didn't change, but he excused himself from the conversation and walked over. "Back again?" he asked, his tone neutral. She cleared her throat, trying to steady her voice. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to thank you again. For what you did. And for accepting my apology." He nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "I appreciate that. But you didn't have to come back." "I know," she admitted, feeling her cheeks flush. But it didn't feel right, leaving things the way they were. For a moment, he said nothing, and the silence stretched between them. Then, to her surprise, he gave a faint smile. "Fair enough. Can I ask you something?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Of course. What made you so quick to assume the worst about me?" His tone wasn't accusatory, but the question struck her like a blow. Her mouth opened, then closed as she struggled to find the right words. I don't know," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Christopher studied her, his expression unreadable. "I've met a lot of people in my life," he said after a pause. "Some are kind right away. Others not so much. But what matters isn't how you start, it's what you do afterward." The weight of his words settled over her, and she realized he wasn't looking for an explanation. He was giving her a chance to reflect, to decide what kind of person she wanted to be moving forward. "I'll do better," she said quietly, the words more a promise to herself than to him. Christopher nodded, his faint smile returning. "That's all anyone can ask." As she left the dealership, her chest felt lighter, though the encounter left her with much to think about. But the story wasn't over yet. 2 days later, she was driving through town when she spotted a familiar figure by the side of the road. Her heart skipped as she realized it was Christopher, kneeling beside a car with its hood open. The irony wasn't lost on her. Without hesitation, she pulled over and stepped out, her nerves replaced by determination. "Need a hand?" she called, walking toward him. Christopher looked up, his expression a mix of surprise and amusement. "You sure about that?" This time, she didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." As she approached, she noticed a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Well," he said, "looks like we've come full circle." The moment felt charged, a strange mix of tension and understanding passing between them. And though she didn't know what would come next, she was finally ready to face it. Christopher stood, wiping his hands on a rag as he motioned toward the car. "Turns out even dealership owners aren't immune to bad luck. Battery's dead. Of all the things, right?" She nodded, stepping closer and glancing at the open hood. "Well, I guess this is my chance to return the favor." He raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "You know how to jump-start a car?" She hesitated for a beat, then gave a small laugh. "Not exactly, but I've got jumper cables in the trunk." "That's a start, right?" Christopher chuckled, the sound light but genuine, and it caught her off guard. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of the man behind the composed exterior, someone approachable, maybe even easygoing. As she retrieved the cables and brought them over, they worked together to connect the cars. She fumbled a little, but Christopher guided her without condescension, his instructions calm and clear. In the process, she noticed something unexpected, a subtle shift in his demeanor. He seemed more relaxed, his guardedness easing as they shared this small, mundane task. When the engine roared to life, she couldn't help but grin. "There we go!" Not bad for someone who had no idea what she was doing 5 minutes ago. Christopher nodded, a faint smile playing at his lips. Not bad at all. Just as she was about to suggest they grab a coffee, partly out of politeness, partly because she wanted to keep the conversation going, a sleek black SUV pulled up behind them. The windows were tinted, and the vehicle exuded an air of authority that made her stomach twist with unease. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, his suit impeccably tailored, but his expression was cold, almost calculating. He walked toward them with a purpose that made the air feel heavier. "Mr. Carter," the man said, addressing Christopher with a clipped tone. "We need to talk." Christopher's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The easygoing warmth vanished, replaced by a tension that seemed to ripple through him. "Not now," he replied firmly, his voice low but resolute. The man's gaze flicked toward her, and she suddenly felt like an intruder in a conversation she had no business overhearing. "Is this a bad time?" she asked, her voice faltering. Christopher shook his head, but his jaw tightened. "It's fine. I'll handle it." The man didn't wait for an invitation, stepping closer and lowering his voice. She couldn't make out the words, but whatever he was saying seemed to weigh heavily on Christopher. His posture stiffened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. She glanced between them, unsure whether to stay or leave. The tension was palpable, and though she didn't know what was going on, it was clear this wasn't just a casual work issue. After a moment, Christopher turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for your help," he said, his tone polite but distant. "I appreciate it." It felt like a dismissal, and though she wanted to push back, to ask what was happening, she nodded. "Of course. Take care." As she walked back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The man's arrival, Christopher's sudden shift in demeanor, it all pointed to a larger issue, one she couldn't begin to piece together. She started her car and drove away, but her mind was racing. Who was that man? And why had Christopher, who seemed so composed and unshakable, reacted the way he did? The questions gnawed at her, and by the time she got home, she knew she couldn't let it go. She didn't know why she cared so much. Maybe it was guilt, maybe curiosity, or maybe something deeper, but she felt a pull she couldn't ignore. The next day, she decided to stop by the dealership again, hoping for answers. But when she arrived, the place was unusually quiet. The energy that had filled the showroom on her previous visits was gone, replaced by a sense of unease. She approached the receptionist, who looked up with a strange smile. "Hi, I was wondering if Christopher was around." The woman hesitated, glancing toward the office at the back of the showroom. "He's in a meeting right now." "Is there something I can help you with?" "No, that's okay," she replied, her curiosity only growing. "I'll come back later." As she turned to leave, she noticed the same black SUV parked outside, its presence sending a chill down her spine. Something was definitely going on, and it was bigger than she had imagined. Over the next few days, she couldn't stop thinking about Christopher and the man from the SUV. The interaction had been brief, but it had left an indelible mark on her. She found herself searching online for anything that might shed light on the situation. What she found shocked her. There were rumors swirling about a hostile takeover attempt targeting Christopher's dealership. Anonymous sources claimed that a major corporation was trying to strong-arm him into selling, using underhanded tactics to pressure him into compliance. The pieces started to fall into place, and her stomach twisted with a mix of concern and guilt. Christopher was dealing with something far more serious than she had realized, and here she was, oblivious to the weight he was carrying. She debated whether to reach out, unsure if it was her place. But as the days passed and the rumors grew louder, she knew she couldn't stay on the sidelines. She didn't know what she could do, but she had to try. Gathering her courage, she drove back to the dealership one evening, hoping to catch him before it closed. When she arrived, the lights inside were dim, and the showroom was empty. But Christopher's car was still in the lot, a sign that he hadn't left yet. She knocked lightly on the glass door, and after a moment, he appeared from the back, his expression wary. He opened the door just enough to step outside, his shoulders tense. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his tone guarded. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice steady despite her nerves. "But I think you might need someone in your corner." Christopher's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment she thought he might dismiss her again. But then he sighed, the tension in his posture easing just a fraction. "Come inside," he said, his voice softer now. As she followed him into the quiet dealership, she couldn't help but wonder what she had just walked into and whether she was ready for the answers she was about to get. Inside the dimly lit dealership, Christopher gestured toward the office at the back. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she'd overstepped by coming here unannounced. But his expression, though weary, carried a flicker of something unexpected, gratitude, perhaps, or relief. She followed him, her steps echoing softly against the tiled floor. Once inside, he closed the door and leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "I'm not sure what you think you can do, but I'll admit, I didn't expect to see you again." She met his gaze, trying to muster confidence. "I don't know what I can do either. But I've been reading about what's happening with the dealership. It sounds serious, and I couldn't just ignore it." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked away. "Serious doesn't begin to cover it. They've been coming after me for months, threats, legal pressure, you name it. They want me out, plain and simple. This place means everything to me. It's not just a business, it's a legacy. But they don't care about that." She stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "Then why haven't you told anyone? If people knew what was happening, they'd support you. You don't have to fight this alone." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because it's not that simple. They've got resources, lawyers, connections. Going public could backfire. And honestly..." He paused, his voice dropping. "I don't know who I can trust anymore." Her heart ached at his words. She hadn't known him long, but she could see the weight he carried, the loneliness that came with it. "I don't have resources or connections," she said, her voice steady. "But I do have honesty. And I think people would listen if you let them see what's really going on." Before he could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Both of them turned toward the door as it swung open, revealing the man from the black SUV. He stepped inside without invitation, his expression as cold and calculated as before. "You should learn to lock your doors, Carter," the man said, his tone dripping with disdain. His eyes flicked to her, and his lips curled into a mocking smile. "And maybe choose your company more carefully." Christopher straightened, his posture tense but unyielding. "What do you want, Jackson?" Jackson stepped closer, his movements deliberate, almost predatory. "What I've always wanted, to make this easy for you. Sell the dealership, walk away with a hefty payout, and save yourself a lot of trouble. Or..." He trailed off, his smirk widening. "We can do it the hard way. Your choice." The tension in the room was suffocating. She could feel Christopher's anger simmering just beneath the surface, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he held his ground, his voice calm but resolute. "I told you before, I'm not selling." Jackson chuckled, shaking his head. "Stubborn to the end, I see. It's admirable, in a way. Foolish, but admirable." She couldn't stay silent any longer. Is this how you operate? Bullying people into giving you what you want? No wonder Christopher doesn't trust anyone. Jackson's gaze snapped to her, his expression darkening. I don't recall inviting you into this conversation. I don't need an invitation, she shot back, her voice unwavering. You might think you're untouchable, but people like you always underestimate one thing: the power of community. If you think no one will stand up for him, you're wrong. For the first time, Jackson hesitated, his confidence faltering. Christopher seized the moment, stepping forward. You heard her, he said, his voice firm. I'm not alone in this. And if you think you can scare me into giving up, you're the one making a mistake. Jackson's smirk returned, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. We'll see about that, he said, his tone less assured than before. With a final, icy glare, he turned and walked out, the door slamming behind him. The silence that followed was heavy, but she felt a surge of determination. He's bluffing, she said, turning to Christopher. He's trying to intimidate you because he knows he doesn't have as much power as he pretends. Christopher gave a small, weary laugh. You're braver than most people I know. Or crazier. Maybe both, she replied with a faint smile. But you're not giving up, are you? He shook his head. Not a chance. Over the next few days, they worked together, gathering evidence of the corporation's tactics and reaching out to the local community. To her surprise, people rallied around Christopher, sharing stories of how his dealership had helped them over the years. Customers, employees, even competitors stepped forward, offering support in ways big and small. But just as it seemed they were gaining momentum, an unexpected twist threatened to unravel everything. Late one night, Christopher received a call from his bank, informing him of a sudden freeze on his accounts. The corporation had filed a lawsuit, claiming breach of contract on a technicality, and the financial strain was immediate. As they sat in his office, poring over the legal documents, Christopher's frustration boiled over. They're trying to drown me in paperwork, hoping I'll run out of time and money to fight back. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but reassuring. Then we'll fight smarter. They might have resources, but we have something they don't: integrity. And that's worth more than they realize. Her words seemed to ground him, and he nodded, his resolve hardening. You're right. They won't win. Not like this. With renewed determination, they reached out to a prominent investigative journalist known for exposing corporate corruption. Within days, the journalist published a scathing expose, detailing the corporation's tactics and shining a spotlight on their unethical behavior. The story went viral, sparking outrage and rallying even more support for Christopher. As the pressure mounted, Jackson reappeared, this time with a smug grin. Congratulations, Carter, he said, his tone mocking. You've made quite the spectacle. But let me remind you, public opinion won't pay your bills. Christopher didn't flinch. And threats won't change the truth. The tension between them was electric, but this time, Christopher wasn't alone. The community had his back, and the corporation was facing scrutiny it hadn't anticipated. In the end, it wasn't a dramatic courtroom battle or a last-minute deal that resolved the conflict. It was the power of people standing together, refusing to be silenced. The corporation quietly withdrew its lawsuit, and Jackson disappeared, his arrogance replaced by defeat. As the dust settled, Christopher turned to her, his gratitude evident. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, she replied, smiling. You just proved something I already knew, that integrity always wins in the end. But just as they celebrated the hard-fought victory, Christopher received a cryptic letter in the mail. It wasn't signed, but the message was clear: this isn't over. The message weighed heavily on Christopher, casting a shadow over the victory they had fought so hard to achieve. He turned the envelope over in his hands, examining the plain paper and typed words. There was no way to trace who had sent it, but the intent was clear: someone wasn't ready to let this battle end. She noticed his expression and stepped closer. What does it say? she asked softly. He handed her the note, watching her face as she read. A crease formed in her brow, but instead of fear, she seemed determined. "They're trying to keep you on edge," she said, her voice steady. "Whoever sent this wants you to feel like you're still under their control. Don't let them win." Christopher nodded, though the unease lingered. "I just can't shake the feeling that this isn't a bluff. Whoever it is, they still have something to lose." She placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Then we'll stay vigilant. You've already shown them you won't back down. This is just one more challenge, and you're not facing it alone." As days turned into weeks, Christopher tried to focus on rebuilding the dealership's reputation and moving forward. The local community continued to show their support, and business began to pick up again. Customers who had stayed loyal throughout the ordeal brought friends and family, eager to contribute to the dealership's recovery. Employees, once anxious about their jobs, worked harder than ever, knowing they were part of something bigger than just a company. But the letter remained in the back of Christopher's mind. Every time the phone rang or a strange car passed the lot, he couldn't help but wonder if it was connected to the threat. Despite her encouragement, the uncertainty gnawed at him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Christopher stood in the parking lot, watching the last customer drive away. The lot was nearly empty, save for a single car parked near the entrance. The headlights flickered on, then off, and his pulse quickened. He walked toward it cautiously, his steps echoing in the stillness. The car door opened, and a figure stepped out. It was Jackson, his usual arrogance replaced by something colder, more calculated. He leaned against the car, crossing his arms as he studied Christopher. "I see you're still here," Jackson said, his tone devoid of mockery this time. Christopher squared his shoulders. "What do you want?" Jackson shrugged, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Just tying up loose ends. You might have won the battle, but the war's far from over." Christopher's jaw tightened. "I'm not afraid of you." "Maybe not," Jackson replied, his smirk fading. "But you should be afraid of the people I work for." "You think exposing me was the end of it?" "They're bigger than me, bigger than you. And they don't forgive or forget." For a moment, the air between them was heavy with tension. But then, Christopher spoke, his voice firm. "Let them come. I'll fight them the same way I fought you, with honesty and integrity. And I won't be alone." Jackson's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He stepped back toward his car, his composure cracking just slightly. "We'll see about that," he muttered before getting in and driving away. Christopher watched the car disappear into the distance, a strange mix of relief and resolve settling over him. He knew the fight wasn't truly over, but he also knew he wasn't the same person he'd been when it started. He was stronger now, not just because of the community that had rallied around him, but because he had learned to trust himself and his values. She found him standing there a few minutes later, her face lit with concern. "Was that him?" she asked. He nodded. "He's trying to scare me again. But it's not going to work." Her lips curled into a small, proud smile. "Good. Because you've already proven that fear doesn't control you. And whatever comes next, we'll handle it together." The days that followed brought a surprising calm. The dealership continued to thrive, and the support from the community only grew. Christopher started partnering with local businesses for events, turning the once targeted dealership into a hub of positivity and connection. The shadow of Jackson's threat remained, but it no longer loomed as large. One afternoon, Christopher received an unexpected visit from the journalist who had exposed the corporation's corruption. She brought news that the corporation was under investigation by federal authorities, thanks to a whistleblower who had come forward with evidence of illegal practices. Jackson's name was among those mentioned in the report. The revelation felt like the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. While it didn't guarantee that the dealership was safe from future challenges, It meant that justice was catching up to those who had tried to destroy him. As the weeks turned into months, Christopher reflected on everything that had happened. The experience had tested him in ways he never could have imagined, but it had also shown him the power of resilience and community. He had faced threats, intimidation, and uncertainty, but he had come out stronger on the other side. She remained a constant presence, her belief in him unwavering. Their bond had deepened through the challenges, and though either of them said it outright, there was a sense that their paths had crossed for a reason. One evening, as they stood in the bustling dealership, watching customers browse the lot, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I think this place is more than just a business. It's a symbol of what can happen when people come together for something they believe in." He smiled, the weight of the past finally lifting. "You're right. And I'm proud to be part of that." As the sun set behind them, casting a warm glow over the dealership, Christopher felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. The road ahead would have its challenges, but he knew he could face them with courage, integrity, and the support of those who believed in him. The story of the dealership wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation, community, and the power of standing up for what's right. And while the chapter with Jackson and the corporation had come to an end, Christopher knew that the values he had fought for would continue to guide him, no matter what the future held.